What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going over some more logic for the fighting game tutorial series. We're going to be going over using wall bounce and ground bounce mechanics. So these are two relatively advanced mechanics. The way we implement them isn't too bad, but the way you can go to implement them further and put them into combos is where it can be a little bit tricky. However, that's mainly going to be on just figuring out the correct launches and applied forces. We're just going to be covering how to get the ground bounce and wall bounces to work. Now, one quick note before we get started, I've removed the grass on this stage just temporarily. I've made it invisible. That way you guys can see the feet better and see the ground bounce better, because I was meant to bring the characters up and I had not done that yet. Also, I expanded the stages a little bit because I like the feeling better, and part of the terrain is raised on this side. So I will adjust the stage length and make that work with this stage in a little bit. But what we are here today to do is we're going to have these camera boundaries that move. Now, I had moving camera boundaries in the past. However, I had them more of like a static move with the characters. I'm now having them as two independent walls that are like the inner walls, so you can walk all the way to a certain edge. Right now we're up against the outer walls, and then outer walls right here. So when we can't move anymore, we're at the outer walls. But they also have a max distance apart, and they move with the characters. And this also includes if they jump. This is important because with the logic we had in code to set the max distance, you could actually get around it just by jumping over it, or actually by sending a projectile over toward your opponent. If you did that, they would actually get knocked out of the balance that they could move, and then they could still move back in. It wasn't breaking that logic, but they could get farther away than they should. Now this prevents them from doing that. So we'll be covering the inner and outer bounds of the camera, because it's more important here since we're doing things with them. Not just that, but let's say we want to do a wall bounce attack. Now the wall bounce attack should go to the screen. So if you attack someone and they hit the edge of the screen, they should be able to wall bounce from there. They don't have to wall bounce, once they hit the actual outer wall. You can set it up however you like. If you don't like that, then, these movable walls in the middle won't be so important to you today. But let me show you an example. So for the wall bounce, I have a command here where I can do this. It's not my regular launch attack, it's just this. And it's it launches him far rather than high. You can, put whatever values you want in for your hitbox, but if I hit him and he hits against the wall, he bounces back, falls on the ground, and then he can do a force get up after 3 seconds, or he can get up by pressing up. The reason he lost there is just because the round timer was out. it was stuck at 0, and then I did damage, so I just killed him. But yeah, so I can actually do that. Now, in my opinion, the actual walls are a little close together, and they're actually a little bit too close to the character, because the wall bounce should probably appear a little bit later. It appears as soon as he touches the side of the screen. Usually, in the examples I've seen, they go off the screen a little bit and then get bounced back. So, you can move these a little bit farther apart. I'll show you how I set the distances. But the wall bounce works, and you can even combo off of it. I actually allowed his hurt box to stay full size a little bit longer so I can get a second hit off, so you can see how that works. You'll have to adjust the timing, the speed of your attacks, the launch distances to make that work and make it flow, but that's one good way to do it. And then we also have ground bounces. Ground bounces aren't too different, it's just they can bounce right off the ground. So there's a few ways we can set this up, but I have this attack that's like this, this overhead attack, which hits them into the ground. Then they get launched up with forces, and then when they collide with again, or when they hit the on-landed function, if they're in the ground bounce state, then they're going to go to the knockdown state. And then again, they're going to do their force recovery, or their press up to get up. You can also combo them out of this. Same thing. I've left the hitbox a little bit bigger for longer. I don't know if I'll be able to pull it off because the animation, the frames are really tough, but there you go. So if I'm mashing the button, I can just hit a second attack. And that's theoretically how you would use these wall bounces and ground bounces, is you could bounce them and then lead them into other combos. So I know that was a lengthy intro, but I think it's important because there's a lot going on in this episode. I want to make it clear what we're going to be covering. So before we go any further, if you want to catch up on the series, this is episode 61. We have a lot that we have done to this point. If you're interested in anything that you saw, I'll leave a link in this iCard in the top right corner to the very first episode of the fighting game tutorial, as well as the playlist. Okay. And otherwise, let's go ahead and get started on this video. It's probably going to be a long one. We're going to need our default camera, because I'm going to make a new function called set inner boundaries. And then we also are going to need our camera edges. Now, we had made these before. These are the same thing we use for the inner and outer edges. I just didn't have any logic in them before. Then we're going to need our NMBP, of course, to do some logic with the hitboxes, but also set some animations for our wall bounces and ground bounces, and all the logic that entails getting up and changing the hurtbox sizes. And we're going to use our hitbox actor BP, because the should ground bounce I'm going to be using as a boolean. You can also use the should wall bounce as a boolean. I'm going to show you two methods today. I'm going to show you the boolean method, where you can just set that and say, yeah, wall bounce, ground bounce, great. I'm also going to show you a method where it just goes off of the state that you're in the attack that was done. So you can either make this a more regulated thing, where, you know, every time you have to force it to a certain value to get it to work, or you can make it a more automated thing, where it will happen basically every time until you tell it not to. Let's start with the camera, because we want the edges to be working, and we want to make sure that we have walls to bounce off of. Now, the wall bounce will work off of the inner or outer boundaries, so I've made the camera edge the same actor for both the outer and inner boundaries. All it is, again, this was in a previous episode. I'll actually link the camera episode here if you do want a refresher on that, even if you already did it. Okay, so the camera edge visualizer is literally just a static mesh component here that I put a cube on. And that's what you're seeing. That's what these planes are. Now, normally they're not visible. I'm making them visible so you can see why the characters are bouncing and what they were bouncing off of and how they move. So you may want to go ahead and make these visible for yourself. Pretty simple to do. Just go into your rendering, visible, and make sure they're not hidden in game. And they need to be blocking all, or blocking all dynamic. Okay. Now, again, that should have already been done, and we didn't have any logic in here before, so you can leave this logic alone for now. What we need to do is go into our default camera and go into our begin play / the use camera custom event we set up. If you don't have the use camera custom event, it's okay. This is just for like restarting the level, and basically anytime we need to force this camera to be the view target, if in case of emergency, like if something goes wrong and we need to force it. So, not a huge deal. But on your begin play, what I was doing in the past, I was getting my player 1 and player 2 from the game mode and setting references in here so I could use them. And then I was spawning 2 camera edges. And I was setting them to be like, I think I was calling them camera bounds or left bound, right bound maybe. Well, I've now, I've renamed them to be left outer edge and right outer edge. So this is all the same logic. I just literally renamed these variables. You can right click and rename them. So there's nothing new here. But I spawned 2 more. And then I set these ones equal to the left inner edge and the right inner edge. These are all the same type, okay? They're all camera edges. So it doesn't matter the order you spawn them in or whatever. We're going to set all these values. We just need to set one to each. Left outer, right outer, left inner, right inner. Then we're going to make a new function called set inner boundaries. And this set outer boundaries function we actually already have. It was this function that I previously had here, which I believe was like change camera view or change camera boundaries, set camera bounds. This was a function we had before. And this function will not change, actually. So this function is just setting the outer boundaries. It's grabbing, it's setting all stages to be the same, basically. It grabs the player 1 reference and the player 2 reference, you know, does some math to determine the location where it should spawn the outer edges, and you're good to go. So I made my stages a little bit bigger by using 1000 instead of 800, and that's why that terrain is a little bit in the way on the one side of that map. But you don't have to change anything with this. I've just changed the name because I think it's important to note, since we're doing inner and outer, we don't want to say just like set camera boundaries or whatever it was called before. It was too generic for what our new use case is. So I'm going to close this. We don't use this. And then I also have a determine left player function that I make. And then my set inner boundaries function. Now, the set inner boundaries function is honestly a little bit of a ripoff of the set outer boundaries function, which is good. It eliminates some of the work we need to do. I don't know how these got all the way out here. Give me 1 second. But I am going to just go over the whole thing again, just to make sure it makes sense. I'll give it a refresher. Okay, so in begin play, again, we're spawning these inner edges now. We want to set the inner boundaries now. The inner boundaries function has a boolean called isPlayer1 on left. And isPlayer1 on left is what it sounds like. Basically, it's just going to determine which character is on the left and is on the right. This is important because, yes, we could use isFlipped as a valid thing to check here, but the problem with that is if you don't want the character to flip, like say you hit them in a certain way and you want them to lock that way, even if they pass over you due to bounce or whatever reason, you may not want them to, if they're flipped or not, to determine the direction they bounce. However, if we determine the character that's on that direction, then we will know. So we can set the inner boundaries based on the player that's on the left and right, because we're going to move the camera edges to the left and right based off of those respective players. Doesn't matter what direction they're facing. Okay, so call this isPlayer1 on left. I put it to true by default. I know it was just false before I was playing around with it. It doesn't really matter because it's going to be updated on tick, so it doesn't really matter what you put in on begin play. I had it true by default. You can also do the same logic we're going to do on tick here and call this function begin play and then pass it into this. It's whatever you want to do. Alright, and then event take of the camera. Luckily, we've already done all this. This is all stuff we've shown in other episodes. At the very end, instead of calling, instead of just ending on set field of view, what I do is I call the determine left player function that we make and the set inner boundaries function and pass in the isPlayer1 on left into the isPlayer1 on left. So both determine left player and set inner bounds have that as a boolean. Determine left player has it as an output boolean. Set inner bounds has it as an input boolean. Now let's go ahead and make these functions. Let's go to determine left player. The logic here is pretty simple. Basically, I'm grabbing my player 1 reference and my player 2 reference that I have in my camera here. I'm getting actor location. So you can bring this onto the screen. Get actor location. And then I can right click and split these. Okay, so I split it for both player 1 and player 2. And then I take the y values and I do a greater than check. Is player 1 y's value, or y value, greater than player 2's y value? And if it is, then, I put it, regardless, I put it into a branch. And then if it is, I say player 1 is not on the left. Their y value is greater. They're on the right. If it's false, player 1 is less than player 2, which means they're on the left. That logic's pretty simple. And then, again, pass that into set inner boundaries, and let's call set inner boundaries. So I'll go over this whole thing really quickly. Now, we have this input boolean is player 1 on left. So drag that into a branch immediately because we want to know who's, which character is responsible for which wall, essentially. And I'll show you what that means in a second. When we play again, I'll show you how it can relate to each character. Alright, so the basics here is that we're going to grab the character that we want. So if player 1 is on left, we're grabbing player 1 reference first. We're getting the actor location. I'm doing a break here just because it's the same way I did it in the set outer bounds. You could also just right click and split like we like to do. And I'm grabbing the y value. That's the important part. I'm subtracting 200 from it because 200 is where I put my camera edges according to my characters. I put them 200 behind my characters, trailing behind at all times. Now, you don't necessarily need to do that, okay? Remember, I said they should be a little bit farther, in my opinion. I think they should be a little bit farther apart. And also, you might not want them to be 200 behind you at all times. For example, if you're too close to your opponent, you might want them to have a minimum distance apart. We're working all this off of a maximum distance apart. If you don't like the camera edges being right up against the characters, feel free to implement a minimum distance. Won't go over that now just because of how much is in this episode, but that is how you could counteract that. Okay, and then I do the same thing with player 2, except I add 200. So remember, this is assuming player 1 is on the left. So minus 200, player 1 minus 200 is going to be the camera edge to the left of player 1, and player 2 plus 200 is going to be the camera edge to the right of player 2. So this logic's pretty easy. We have this make vector where I'm putting everything, all these values back together into a new vector, and I'm going to set these to the set. I'm going to bring these to the set actor location nodes here on the right. Don't worry about that yet. We'll get to that in a second. The important part is that you have this for both player 1 and 2. And then here's the actual code flow logic. If you see, we didn't have to plug the white line into any of that yet. What I do is I grab my player 1 reference, I get the character state, and make sure they're not equal to launched. Now, the reason I do this and make sure they're not equal to launched is because if they're equal to launched, we want the camera edges to stop moving. In this case, we do, at least. It's possible you don't want that in your game, but I want them to stop moving because if the character is launched, I want them to be able to collide with the edges and the camera boundaries a little bit easier. So instead of having them move, we only let them move if they're not launched. You could add some other conditions in here as well, like if they're not in the bouncing states and things like that, which we'll add later. But if they're not launched, true, then continue. Then check, make sure player 2 is not launched, and then continue. For the record, you could do a false and still move like the left camera boundary, even if player 2 was launched. I simply didn't because I didn't feel that it was necessary. I did a lot of tests with this, and it didn't really seem to mess with the gameplay at all, but a lot of the times you guys know better than I do for a lot of these mechanics. So if that's the case, feel free to correct me. You would fix it right here. Okay, like I said, I've done the same thing for player 2. And only if this is true that it's not launched. Only if this is true that it's not launched, then we're going here into another branch. This branch is basically going to check that the distance between these camera edges is at its max value or less. Okay, so the reason for this is because we were using encode on the characters when they were moving right, and I'll go through it right now, in the move right function and in the move right controller function, we were using this logic that I've now commented out. I will remove it after this episode, but I wanted to show you guys so you're aware of it. And this line can actually be taken above it as well. All of this logic right here was to basically stop the characters from moving in a given direction if they were too far away. And this is what I was saying, you could hit them with a projectile and they could fly out, or they could actually just jump over. There were a lot of tricks to it, but now that we have actual walls blocking the characters, this isn't an issue. So you can feel free to comment out all this logic. Make sure you leave add movement input in, because you still need to be able to move and move right. And you can do the same thing in move right controller. I have not commented out in this one, so for me it still looks like this. But again, feel free to comment everything out and just leave add movement input. Okay. Alright. The reason I bring that up is because first of all, we're not using that anymore. And what's important here is the max distance apart that I had chosen for that was 800. So I'm actually using that value here if you like where your stages are set up, if you like the way the camera's set up, and you only want the characters to go about 800 distance apart from each other, then you can just bring that value right into here. What we're doing here is we're getting the distance between these actors. The way you can always do that is grab the location on the appropriate axis. In this case, we want to grab the Y value off of our axes. So the Y value of our player 1 and our Y value of our player 2, or the Y value of our camera edge for our left camera edge and our right camera edge. Whatever you want to do, either way works. It's up to you for your design preference. but I'm grabbing this y value and I'm grabbing this y value. Now the order you subtract them in does not matter because we're going to perform an absolute value operation on this. So think of it this way. If player 1 is at the coordinates, if their y value is at the coordinates negative 400 and player 2 is at the y coordinates 200. Okay, so negative 400 minus 200 is negative 600. We grab absolute value and they're 600 units apart. I mean, and you can do the math. So how would you get from negative 400 to 200? You would add 600. They are 600 units apart. It will work the other way. So say player 1 is 200 units and player 2 is at negative 400. Well, 200 minus negative 400 is 200 plus 400, which is 600. So absolute value of 600 is 600. The absolute value is just how far this value is from 0. So if you have negative 600 and 600, they're both going to return the same value after this absolute value check, which is 600. So there you go. We check if that's greater than 800. As long as it's not false, then we go ahead and we move the edges. Left inner edge and the right inner edge. Now what's important here is the left edge has to come from the player that we're assuming is on the left. Well, actually that we know is on the left. So player 1 reference is on the left. So you can see I bring the vector here from the make vector and bring it all the way into the set actor location for the left inner edge. Now this is the player 2 reference and we make vector and set the right inner edge. Straighten this. Okay, so this is done. And this bottom part is the exact same logic. You're going to change one thing. So here we go. The set inner boundaries, if it's false, we're going to use player 2 reference first and player 1 reference second. Okay, so anything that was done on player 1, like this make vector, since we're using player 2 reference first, this needs to go to the left inner edge now. And the player 1 reference make vector now needs to go to the right inner edge. But you can see the logic is the same for literally everything else. So you can copy and paste and just change these two nodes and it'll be working. Now, you didn't have to, do a branch and copy this. You could easily make a function or even an event and just pass in the player reference. I'm just doing that because for me, I thought it was the nicest to look at and to explain at the moment. Okay, and that was a lot right off the bat, but that's the important part to get your camera boundaries moving. And at this point, you can fully modify how far they are from the characters, if they have a minimum or maximum distance, and when they're moving. Like, again, when they're not launched, we want to move them. So you have a lot of freedom with that, and you can use that for a lot of things in the future. We're done with the camera for now. We don't need anything else for this episode, so we can actually close out of the default camera. Now, I'm going to go to the camera edges. Now, the way I have this set up, I have the logic set up specifically to happen if the character is launched. So if they collide with a camera edge visualizer, which, remember, that's just the static mesh here. That's all this is. If they collide with the static mesh, specifically if a character collides with the static mesh, then we check if they're launched, and if they're launched, we're going to bounce them. Remember what I said earlier? You can either use states or you can use booleans on each attack to determine if an attack that lands should wall bounce or ground bounce. Well, if you want the boolean method, then instead of checking the character state for launched, you're going to want to check the character for should ground bounce right here. Excuse me, should wall bounce. There we go. So you'll want to check this instead if you don't want to use character states. And again, if you want to just set it specifically for every attack, like we do for the ground bounce. It's fully up to you. I'm giving you all the options. The way the camera edge works, though, is we're going to want to go to our camera edge visualizer, or whatever your static mesh is that shows you what the camera edge is. And we're going to want to scroll down, and on component hit, click the little plus. It'll create this node for you. We take the other actor, so the other actor that's not the camera edge visualizer that, collided with this object. Well, the other actor should be the fighter. So drag off the other actor and do cast to your type. In our case, it's fighter template character. And then, I just went over this, but do your logic that you want here. In my case, I'm doing character state equals launched. And if it is equal to launched, true, Then I determine what direction I want to launch them. In this case, flipped is perfectly valid. It is possible you know, there are special attacks where you don't want them to launch a certain way because maybe you turn them around before you kick them into the wall or something. So there's some special cases where you may not want to use is flipped here. And, you know, those are kind of they'll have to be addressed case by case. In fighting games, there's so many specific attacks that it's impossible to really avoid doing that one way or another. But for now, is flipped is good. And if it is flipped, I'm just going to call launch character with positive 800 on the Y and 100 on the Z. If they're not flipped, remember, this is the character that collided with the wall, then I'm going to launch them again, but I'm going to launch them negative 800 on the Y, 100 on the Z. I am checking the X, Y, and Z overrides. So we've mentioned this before. We've kind of gone over it, and I'm like, it's not really important. Well, it wasn't really important, and now it's becoming more important. So these overrides, basically, I'll let the comments speak for themselves, but they essentially set the velocity, the forces that are being used on this axis for this character, as opposed to adding to those forces. And this is important, because if you launch a character with like 2,000 force on the Y, and you only bounce them back with 800, well, they're going to actually just kind of stand still or like sit there in the air and just fall down because they don't have enough force to override that. And it depends on a lot of factors, right? So, you know, there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. But if you use this override, I use both the X, Y, and the Z override, then this new force will be the force being applied to the character. It will cancel out all previous forces and use this. Now, if you want your force to be related to how much force they had going into it, there's two things you could do. When the character gets hit, you could save out the forces that are on that attack, that are on that launch or on that pushback, and then you could use them here and pass them into the launch velocity. You can always right-click the split struct pin and separate them, so you could pass in Y and Z separately, you know, without making a new vector. You could also do like a percentage of it. You know, you don't have to do the whole distance, but you could just multiply by a number like 0.3 or something and do 1/3 of the launch in the other direction. You could do a bunch of different things. You could actually apply the launch distance. You could add that launch distance to the hitbox and then grab the last hitbox that hit the enemy and then grab it from there. There's a ton of different ways. I'm doing a flat value, and that's actually not me being lazy. I just like the way that was working better. For me, it was more consistent, and I knew where the enemy was going to bounce, which allowed me to kind of set up for it for my next attack. But it's all up to you. The last thing is, after that, we want to set the character state to be wall bounced. Now, you might not have that state yet. You can see I'm launching from Visual Studio, and that's just because enums work better from Visual Studio when you launch from there, so you don't have to rebuild everything. You know how, like, when you would change your enum, you would have to remake everything. Luckily, you don't have to do that if you launch from Visual Studio, so you can see I'm doing that now. But I've added 2 new states. I've added E wall bounce and E ground bounce. You don't have to separate them. You could make them the same, but the way we're going to do it, it's going to be really, really beneficial to separate them, so I think it's worth it. So we got, like I said, E wall bounce, E ground bounce, and while we're here, just because I am giving you both options, you can go ahead and add your booleans if you want to use these. Should ground bounce and should wall bounce. We are going to be using the should ground bounce in the hitbox specifically, but you can also easily use should wall bounce in the same method we use should ground bounce, so you'll be able to see kind of how it comes into play. And I should have changed this comment to with the wall, but that's okay. If you make those booleans, make sure you set them false in the constructor. And once you've made them, then you'll be able to set the character state. It's okay if you don't set it right now. You know, take your time. Maybe set it toward the end if you want. That way you have everything that you need, and you don't have to like keep going back and forth between the code and the blueprint. But it's very important that I mention, make sure you set this. If you don't set this because we forgot because, you know, it wasn't in the code yet, then you'll have issues with the wall bounce logic, and it will just be because this enum wasn't set up yet. So we're good on that part. Let's go into the code a little bit and set up some other logic that we may need. So the first thing that I'm going to say is just make sure that, as always, your states are accurately representing what you want to do. So for example, I don't want to be able to jump when I'm crouching. It's a new thing I've added because I realized that you could do that. And I said, I don't really want to do that. But more importantly, related to this episode, I have it to where you can't jump if you're knocked down, in recovery, in the wall bounce state, or in the ground bounce state. You know, you can feel free to change all those and set them to your liking, but I thought that was necessary. I also added that logic to the crouching, start crouching, stop crouching. I probably should have added it to blocking as well. I did not in this case, but you see what I'm saying? There's so many places here you could put it. I did put it in the move right and the move right controller. Same here. So there's a lot of places where it's important that you are making sure the states are in the right spot before you allow the character to do an action. Now there's another important thing down here. This one's really important. So we have this end stun function. Now basically when you get hit, whether you're in hit stun or block stun, we set a timer, and that timer, once that timer's up, then they're done being stunned, so then they can go back to normal. Now that's good, but we weren't adding any other states here other than launched, and so this can cause some issues where we were setting our character state back to default before it should have been set back to default. Make sure in end stun, you can't return to end stun, or at least you can't return to the default state. You can get set back to can move and you won't get stuck. But you can't get set back to the default state unless you're not launched, not knocked down, not recovery, not wall bounce, not ground bounce. It's important, since we're making this data only be able to be set when these states aren't true. In the anim BP, the character needs to be able to get out of those states and return to default on their own without this. They need to be able to go from every state, which is how it should be from the beginning. But I know it's it's a lot of states, so that's the reason we haven't done that for every state. But it is important to note you can run into issues if you don't have the proper transitions and just transition ability, really. The fact that you can go from one state to the other, because you just don't set it up, it won't work. And that should be about it. It's more just you can set them in different spots and make sure that it's the right states before performing logic. Now, one other thing with the wall bounce enum, make sure in tick, if you don't want them to be able to flip while they're bouncing off the wall, then you can go ahead and make sure that the character state is not equal to wall bounce. You can also just set can flip to be false if they wall bounce, but I just kind of like this method better because I can look down at the tick function and know exactly what's going on. I'll bring this back up. There are a few more things we have to do in code, but that's the majority of it for right now. Actually, there is one more thing we should go over first. In the hitbox actor BP, I've also added a should cause ground bounce boolean. And you can choose to do this or not. Again, it's up to you if you want it to be determined by the attack or by the forces or whatever. In this case, if you want to be determined by the hitbox if the character should wall bounce or ground bounce upon being hit, assuming there's no other conditions that cancel them out of it, then you're actually going to want to have booleans in your hitbox actor. I don't have a wall bounce one in this case, but I do have should cause ground bounce that we can set for each attack. Of course, in my constructor, I set it to be false by default. The next thing we want to do is go into our anim BP. Now, let's avoid the attacks themselves right now with this logic. Let's just go over the state machine, because there's quite a few states we need to add, and different places we can add them from. First of all, wall bounce. Wall bounce can go only from launched in my game. You can add any transitions you want to it. It's not too bad. Like, it's not a specific state that has to come from somewhere. It's more just your logic. The way I have it working is I have it, if the state is wall bounced and they're in launched, then they can just go straight to the wall bounce animation. The other important factor that I've added here is I have added the ability to go from the stun to launched using the launched character state. I had that in the past, but I never really mentioned it on video. I just kind of showed what I was doing. So just for the record, you should be able to go from your stun to your launch. And the reason I'm making a point of that now is because for some of these attacks, if we're going to trigger the ground bounce and wall bounce, we might not even be launching them, like specifically for the ground bounce. So if you want to launch them in the future or launch them due to that attack, you do need to have this transition. Otherwise, you'll go from, you'll be stuck in the stun animation as opposed to the launched animation. Alright, so we have the ability to go from launch to wall bounce, and that's good. Now, we need all the logic. All the logic needs to be in place here for this to work correctly. Alright, so we're in wall bounce. Let's click on that. Let's click on the transition, make sure there's no transition events, nothing like that. Let's go into the animation. You can see that I have it set to not loop, of course. And what I have is I basically have this. It looks kind of silly when it's playing like that. But what it is it's him hitting the wall and then being launched that way. So you can see his arms are expanding out like he's been hit in the back and he's being launched that direction. We're going to keep him on this frame until he lands. He calls the on landing function or hits the ground. And important note here, so I don't want root motion on this animation, but I can do something called force root lock. So force root lock will try and basically stop the animation from moving outside of where the character is. It's essentially disabling that movement that you get without root motion. So it can be very useful in cases like this. We were trying to do the opposite a lot of the time before, where we were trying to get some sort of motion or trigger some sort of motion. In this case, this animation had motion on it, and I didn't want that. I wanted to determine that by the logic and code. So I disabled root motion, but I also forced root lock, so this will stay with the character that it's attached to and the skeleton that's attached to. Okay, so that's the first animation I have. And then it can only go to knockdown, wall bounce to knockdown. And the transition is just that the state is now knocked down. Not too bad. No transition events, and nothing on the actual state itself. Click into it. It's not set to loop, and here's the bounce off the ground. So when they wall bounce, they still do a minor ground bounce just because that's the animation I've given them. I don't lift them up into the air if they hit the ground off of a wall bounce. But you can feel free to change that if you'd like. You'll see how we do that shortly. So you can see right here, he's just got an animation where he kind of flails against the ground as he hits it. Whoops. Also important, if you want to see this transition, I know I showed you this, but if you want, this is what it looks like to go from wall bounce to knockdown. Okay. And now we start getting into some familiar logic, like you can actually see it here with the launch to knockdown idle where he landed on his back. We're doing basically the opposite. You can see I have knockdown front, knockdown idle, and all that good stuff here. So I'm going to trigger all the same logic where we can change the size of the hurt box, and we can change the get up timer and things like that. So to go from knockdown front to knockdown idle, I just basically do it automatic rule based. So once this animation, the knockdown animation that just played where he kind of flails on the ground, is finished, then he'll go to his knockdown idle. I have the start get up timer in the start transition event here. If you want to see the wake ups and the get ups, I can leave an iCard right here in the top right corner for that video to go over all that logic. But it's the same logic as we have here in the launched to colliding with the ground. So I have the start get up timer on the node itself. Once it gets into here, you can do it on start transition. It doesn't really hurt anything. I'm putting it on the node so that anytime we go to this transition, it'll have that automatically. We won't have to apply that every single transition that occurs. We don't want to have to type this in over and over again. But it's really just preference. So start get up timer once we enter this. No transition events needed. Now, knockdown front idle is, of course, a looping animation, but it's only like, I think it's literally one frame. So, it's looping, but there's not really anything to loop. If you had movement on the ground here or something, that would be a little bit more beneficial. And then knockdown idle front can go to knockdown front recovery, which again is the same logic as knockdown idle and knockdown recovery. You can see that the transition rule is recovery. I made a shared rule, which is why it's green, and I've called it recover from knockdown, or KD. So basically, if we're in knockdown idle front and we go into recovery, then we're going to call the knockdown recovery front animation. In this transition, we want to invalidate the get up timer. At this point, they're already getting up. There's no reason to try and force it after a certain amount of time. Or, at this point, it's already been a certain amount of time, so there's no reason to use that anymore. That's what it looks like, just in case you want to see it out there. Then, knockdown recovery front. It's not looping, and it's just him standing up, the mutant standing up. I've sped it up a lot because this animation is like 8,000 frames almost. Lastly, this has to return to idle once he's back up and ready, so I make it automatic rule-based, and on end transition event, so once it's basically directly back in idle, I end get up logic. So we won't go over all the stuff that all those events do. They resize the hurt box and all those things. Again, that's in the wake up episode, the wake ups and knockdowns episode, I believe is what it's called. So that's good for the wall bouncing animations. And the good thing is the ground bounce can basically follow the exact same logic except for the actual ground bounce animation and anything that pertains to that, like launching the character high off the ground once they've collided with the ground. To do this, I do have it coming from two ways. They can go from launch to ground bounce because I know this is a possibility. However, we're not going to be using that in this case because the only attack I have that has the ground bounce capability is the one where he is standing on the ground. Doesn't mean we couldn't make it work, but just haven't integrated enough to make it work yet. So we're going to go from idle to ground bounce. But you can add this transition for as many states, to as many states as you need. So I have idle to ground bounce, and the condition is should ground bounce, which is the boolean that we have in the code on the character to determine if they should ground bounce when they collide with the ground. If that is true, that they should ground bounce, we're going to play the ground bounce animation here. So we have the loop animation off as usual. I have the ground bounce G height. So mutant bounce ground height is what this is. This is basically the same animation. He's kind of flailing. It's slightly different. But I've added an anim notify that we can use to actually launch the character up into the air at this specific point in the animation when he should be flying back up in the air. I've got a gain height off ground bounce. We'll address that in a second. So now that we've played this animation, it's the same logic here, where we're going to go to knockdown idle front. So to go from ground bounce to knockdown, we need our character state to be knocked down. The whole point of this is to make it so that once the animations are finished for bouncing or being launched or whatever, they end up in the state where then the next event has to happen. They have to either get up, someone has to attack them while they're on the ground, it becomes this other game inside of a game that you're playing with the enemy player. So they go to the knockdown state, there's no transition events, and then we go to knockdown idle front, which, as I've said, we have the start get up timer, and then the process starts again. So that's how you can have the wall bounce and the ground bounce in the NMBP. Let's go into the event that we made for our launching the character up off of a ground bounce. Should be over here. Yep. So here's my gain height off ground bounce. The way you reach these anim notifies, as I always say, is you can either type anim notify or just type the name. And mine is gain height off ground bounce. You want the event. So for the event, we want to basically just launch our character. A specified height, again, you can use it off of hitbox, variables or forces that you want to apply to each specific attack, or it can just be a flat value like I'm doing in this case. Basically, I grab the mutant character reference, I call launch character, and then I give it 800 on the Z and do the Z override. So it'll be just 800 units in the Z, or 800 of the force of the launch velocity for the Z axis. Then I set should ground bounce back to false. So should ground bounce is what determines if you can go into the ground bounce state. Once we've already gained the height off the ground bounce, at this point we don't want to land and then trigger the functionality again, because you'll see here in a second, it's the next thing we're going to cover, the ground bounce and all those states are kind of determined based off of the landed function. So if we landed and we go to ground bounce, we bounce, we don't want to keep bouncing forever. Set this back to false. Okay? So we'll go over the landed function, and then we have to look at the hitboxes. In our fighter template character, we can go to landed. And here's the logic we already have. We had these lines commented out. We have, if they're jumping, do this logic. And then we had this other else, where it was like, else if they're launched, then do this logic. Say they should go to knockdown. But we need a few more conditions now. So first of all, if they're launched, they can still go to knockdown. But we want to make sure that they should not be ground bouncing based off this launch. So the first check that I have in this else if is if the character state is not, or is equal to launched, and they should not ground bounce. Then they'll go to knockdown. So if I hit them up into the air, then they hit the ground, then great, they can go to knockdown. Next, I have it so or, this is an or. So it's either this condition in the parentheses here, that's condition 1, or character state equals wall bounce. So if they were wall bounced, remember the state gets set to wall bounce once they collide with the wall. So once they've collided with the wall, then they're in the wall bounce state. If they collide with the wall, they're in the wall bounce state, and then they collide with the ground, we want to make sure that they go to the knockdown state. That is the appropriate state to go to. Or if they're in the ground bounce state. So if they're in the ground bounce state is, it happens after they collide with the ground, and once they're back up in the air, again, you don't want them to fall and go back into the ground bounce state. If they've already bounced once, then they need to go to knockdown. So this logic is the same as it was prior. I just updated the else if statement here. And I also have another else if should ground bounce is true. So this, we never checked if it was true in the above if statement. And because of that, if it's true, when we've landed and neither of these other conditions are true, then that means we are in the perfect example of when we need to ground bounce. So basically, we've either been launched and should ground bounce, or we've just been put directly into a state where we should ground bounce, whether we've been launched or not, just like the mutant's attack that's in overhead. So we set the character state. Okay? And there you go. So the way you can see this in the default state machine is that we go from should ground bounce to be true. So then we go ahead and trigger the ground bounce animation. This gets us height when the anim notifier on this animation hits. And when we get height off of that animation, we're going to fall back down and hit the ground again. At this point, the state has already been set to ground bounce. So this else if will be taken, and then we will set the state to knock down. Since the state is now knocked down, we can go from ground bounce to knockdown idle front. Just like that. You could also actually go to the knockdown front if you wanted. I just felt it was a little repetitive to do that since they're very similar animations. But technically, you probably should have some sort of collision when you hit the ground as opposed to just that one frame that I have. But that's all preference and making it look nice. The functionality won't change. Alright, after this, what we need to do is update our hitbox to determine what attacks can actually do this. So if you don't want to have a specific, section, like every attack can perform ground bounce or can perform wall bounce, we need to tag the attacks just like we do all these other things. So, you probably know the drill by now, but if you go into your hitbox actor.h, I've added a boolean should cause ground bounce, which we covered earlier, and I set it to false in the constructor, but make sure that it's U property and all this stuff, that way we can access it in Unreal. Now we're going to use these variables that we made. Same with should wall bounce if you decided to make it, or should cause wall bounce, I guess. And when you recompile this, then you should have your variables for your hitbox. What we need to do is add our actual function for our create active hitbox. We want to add a variable for the should ground bounce here so that we can tag it for each attack. So just add another input, make it a boolean, should ground bounce, and you can see everyone is false except for this one specific overhead attack that I want to use it on. I've set it to be true. And now this logic is very, very similar to you at this point, but the should ground bounce, basically it comes down here. Can't even see it, it's getting so big of a function. It's this top red line here, and it gets brought into the should cause ground bounce set node, which we're setting from the hitbox actor. So hitbox actor BP, you can see this is the blue line. I drag off of the hitbox actor. I call it set should cause ground bounce. And this is the variable that we have in the hitbox actor. So I'm setting that to the value that we manually put in for this attack. And then this other stuff is stuff that's already been done. This is attaching a hitbox to an actor, and then proximity and active hitboxes and all that good stuff. Now at this point, we can go into our hitbox actor BP, and we have our check collision function, and we have all the logic to determine if someone's taking damage. Now, in the take damage function, you can feel free to add another node for should ground bounce and handle the logic there. You can also do this if you'd like, where you just use the should cause ground bounce variable from the hitbox actor. We can just use it now without a reference because we are in a hitbox actor BP. So get should cause ground bounce. And then you see I'm grabbing the corresponding player. Player 2 is the player being hit by this attack. So at this point, should ground bounce is being set to true. Well, it's actually being set to the should cause ground bounce value, but in the case of that attack, it would be set to true. And same with player 1. Now, I'd honestly advise being careful just adding random variables and sets like this. It's not really the best method to do it. There was a lot going on in this video, and I'm trying not to overload it by changing all the functions a bunch. So feel free to put it in the take damage function. I very well may update it, and I may update it to add the should wall bounce variable as well. So if we play our game again, we'll make sure everything's working as intended. We got the mutant and the dark mutant over here, and we have our walls, right? So either player should be able to hit them into the other wall. Now, understand that our commands and our input buffers only support one player at a time right now. We don't have keyboard support for it because we're actually using specific keys and buttons as opposed to input actions. And that will be changing very soon, so don't worry about that. But for now, I can't actually trigger that animation for player 2. What I can do is hit player 2 into the wall from the left side or the right side, so we'll start with this. And I'll go ground bounce, and he flies up into the air. Everything's working. Gets back up, all good to go. Now, I'm gonna do this attack. They wall bounce. They actually collide with me. So if you don't like the way they collide here, like how it collides with me, you can disable collision the same way we disabled it on the throw. And I can cover that. Or you can click on this icon right here, where it shows the logic that we have for the throws, where we disable collision essentially for the character with other characters. They can fly by. I can also go on the other side of them and do the same thing. But you see he can bounce here, and again, feel free to disable collision if you'd like. I will probably be doing that, but I'm going to play around with it a bit more. We've got plenty of more episodes to do, and more with bouncing and combos as well. So this is a good stopping point for now. Just the fact that we have the bouncing functionality down, we can modify it to our liking. Alright guys, well thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed and you learned something, please subscribe. It does more for the channel and for me than anything else you can do. It lets me know that you like this content and that I'm doing a good job teaching you, which I appreciate. It just makes me feel good. If you did have any issues with this tutorial, I know this one was long, or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord. We've got a good community and we'll be happy to help you with any issues you've got. Lastly guys, if you want to come support us on Twitch, twitch.tv/Shawnthebro27. You can also look at the YouTube archive channel, which is Shawnthebro27 on YouTube, which has all the Twitch streams. We started doing programming streams now, so we do a bunch of these guys where we just kind of play around, you know, start making cool game mechanics, and maybe we'll put together a full game in the end. I want to give a huge shout out to all my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters, guys. Thank you so much for the support and for helping me continue this series. Seriously, it's so nice to see all the support this series is getting, because I get so excited about all the upcoming mechanics, so I'm glad you guys are excited as well. Thank you very, very much. And everyone, I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.